The morning sun peeked through the windows of Atlanta International Airport as Dorothy Thompson walked slowly toward Gate B-17. At 72, she moved with the careful grace that came with age, but her eyes still sparkled with the same sharp intelligence that had guided her through decades of business success. She adjusted her simple pearl necklace, a gift from her late husband on their 40th anniversary, and checked her boarding pass one more time. Dorothy wasn't someone who stood out in a crowd. She wore a modest navy blue dress and comfortable shoes, her silver hair neatly styled in a short bob. The only hint of her wealth was a vintage designer handbag, worn not for show, but because it had served her well for 15 years. First-class passengers for Skyline Airlines Flight 427 to New York were now ready for boarding, announced a cheerful voice over the loudspeaker. Dorothy gathered her things and joined the small line forming at the gate. A young couple in front of her chatted excitedly about their honeymoon plans. Behind her, a businessman spoke loudly into his phone about quarterly reports. Dorothy smiled politely when their eyes met, but he barely noticed her, too wrapped up in his conversation. As wide, she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent. The young woman smiled warmly. "Have a wonderful flight, Ms. Thompson." Dorothy thanked her and made her way down the jet bridge, feeling the familiar mix of excitement and slight nervousness she always felt when flying, even after all these years. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant with a name tag reading Pamela greeted passengers with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard. Turn right for first class, please." Dorothy nodded gratefully and turned right, finding her window seat in the third row. She stowed her small carry-on under the seat in front of her, rather than asking for help with the overhead bin. Years of independence had taught her to manage on her own whenever possible. The first-class cabin filled quickly. A middle-aged white man in an expensive suit took the aisle seat next to Dorothy with barely a glance in her direction. He immediately pulled out his laptop and began typing. Dorothy didn't mind. She was looking forward to enjoying the peaceful flight with the new mystery novel she'd brought along. Flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, helping passengers settle in. A tall male flight attendant with the name Richard on his badge offered pre-departure drinks to the first row, then the second. His smile was professional, but didn't quite reach his eyes. When he reached Dorothy's row, he leaned across her to offer her seatmate a drink. "Good morning, sir. Would you care for a pre-departure beverage? We have orange juice, water, or champagne available." The man requested champagne without looking up from his screen. Richard nodded and turned away without acknowledging Dorothy. She gently raised her hand. "Excuse me, I'd like some water, please." Richard's eyes flicked to her briefly. "I'll be back around in a moment," he said, already moving to the next row. Dorothy watched as he continued serving other passengers, offering the same choices with varying degrees of warmth depending on who he was addressing. She noticed how he lingered to chat with a younger woman in designer clothes, complimenting her purse and asking about her destination. 10 minutes passed, and Richard had completed his first round of service without returning. To Dorothy, she wasn't angry. She'd experienced this kind of oversight before, but she was thirsty after her walk through the terminal. When Richard passed by again, Dorothy raised her hand slightly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but could I please have that glass of water now?" Richard paused, his smile tightening just slightly. "We're preparing for departure. I'll have to come back after we're in the air," he said, despite the fact that he was currently delivering another glass of champagne to a passenger 2 rows ahead. Dorothy's seatmate glanced over with a slight frown, seeming to notice the discrepancy in treatment, but said nothing and returned to his work. The boarding process completed and the flight attendants performed their safety demonstration. Dorothy listened attentively as she always did, remembering how her husband used to tease her for being the only CEO who actually paid attention to the oxygen mask instructions. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Dorothy felt the familiar rumble beneath her feet. She loved this part, the powerful feeling of the aircraft coming to life, preparing to defy gravity once more. It reminded her of building her company, that same sense of overcoming seemingly impossible odds. The plane took off smoothly, climbing into the clear blue sky above Atlanta. Dorothy watched through her window as the city grew smaller, the patchwork of buildings and roads transforming into a miniature model world below. Once they reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off and the cabin crew began their in-flight service. Pamela, the flight attendant who had greeted passengers at the door, served the first 2 rows on the opposite aisle, while Richard returned to Dorothy's side of the cabin. "Something to drink?" he asked Dorothy's seatmate, who requested coffee, with cream. Dorothy waited for Richard to turn to her next, but instead he leaned across and asked the passengers in the row behind if they would like anything. Dorothy took a deep breath and tried once more. "Excuse me, I still haven't received any water," she said, her voice calm but firm. Richard's expression flickered with annoyance. "I'm going in order, ma'am. I'll get to you." But he didn't. He completed, serving the entire right side of the first-class cabin, somehow managing to skip Dorothy each time. She watched as other passengers received their drinks and snacks, some even getting refills before she'd been served at all. An older white couple sitting across the aisle had been watching the situation unfold. The woman caught Dorothy's eye and gave her a sympathetic look. Her husband frowned and whispered something to his wife, who nodded in agreement. Dorothy's seatmate had also noticed. He cleared his throat as Richard passed by again. "Excuse me, but I believe this lady has been trying to get a glass of water for quite some time now." Richard paused, his professional smile firmly in place. "Of course. I'll bring that right away." 5 more minutes passed. Dorothy's throat felt dry, and a slight headache was beginning to form behind her eyes. She hadn't wanted to make a scene, she never did, but this treatment was beyond poor service. It felt intentional. From across the aisle, Pamela noticed Dorothy's situation. During a brief lull in her service, she approached with a warm smile. "Can I get you something to drink, ma'am?" "Just water, please," Dorothy replied gratefully. "Thank you for asking." "No problem at all, I'll be right back with that." Moments later, Pamela returned with a glass of water and a small package of cookies. "Here you go. Please let me know if you need anything else." Dorothy thanked her sincerely, noticing how Richard glanced over with a tight expression. It was a look she recognized from countless business meetings over the years, the look of someone who didn't think she belonged in her seat. As the flight progressed, the pattern continued. Richard was attentive to every other passenger in his section, but consistently overlooked Dorothy. When meal service began, he handed out hot towels to everyone except her. When he distributed tablecloths and silverware, Dorothy had to remind him that she had been missed. "Oh, did I forget you?" he asked with exaggerated surprise. "Let me get that for you." The businessman next to Dorothy had grown increasingly uncomfortable witnessing this treatment. During one of Richard's absences, he turned to her. "Is there something going on here that I'm missing? His behavior seems incredibly unprofessional." Dorothy gave him a gentle smile. "Nothing I haven't experienced before," she said simply. "Well, it's completely unacceptable," the man replied, looking genuinely bothered. When the meal trays were being distributed, Richard placed Dorothy's down last, nearly sloshing her drink onto her tray. The chicken entree she received was barely warm, unlike the steaming plates delivered to other passengers. The couple across the aisle had been watching the entire situation with growing discomfort. The woman finally spoke up when Richard passed by. "Excuse me, but we've noticed that you seem to be deliberately providing poor service to the lady in 3A. Is there a reason for that?" Richard's face flushed slightly. "I'm serving everyone equally, ma'am. Perhaps you've misunderstood." "I don't think so," the woman's husband interjected. "We've been flying first class for 30 years, and we know what good service looks like." Dorothy appreciated their support, but felt uncomfortable being the center of attention. "It's all right," she said quietly. "Let's just enjoy the rest of the flight." But the damage was done. Other passengers had noticed too, and the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had grown tense. A younger black woman sitting 2 rows behind, Dorothy had been watching everything unfold with a particular interest that went beyond mere curiosity. As the flight attendants collected meal trays, this woman, Lisa Harris, though no one on the plane knew her name yet, pulled out her phone and made a brief text message. Her face betrayed no emotion, but her fingers moved with purpose over the screen. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing the seatbelt sign to illuminate with a soft ding. Richard moved through the cabin, checking that passengers had secured their belts. When he reached Dorothy, he barely glanced at her before moving on. Dorothy sighed quietly and returned to her book, though she found it hard to concentrate on the story. In her decades of building businesses, fighting for her place, in rooms people like her weren't expected to succeed. She had developed a thick skin. But sometimes the weight of these small indignities still pressed heavily on her heart. What Richard didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was exactly who he had been treating with such casual disrespect. Dorothy took a sip of her now warm water and turned another page in her book, waiting patiently as the plane continued its journey toward New York, where things would take an unexpected turn for everyone on board, especially for Richard. The flight was now halfway to New York, cruising at 35,000 feet above a blanket of clouds. Dorothy Thompson had given up on getting proper service from Richard and instead focused on her mystery novel. She had just reached a pivotal chapter when the plane hit another patch of turbulence, causing her glass of water to slide dangerously close to the edge of her tray table. As Dorothy reached to steady it, Richard rushed past, bumping her arm. The water spilled onto her dress, soaking through to her skin. She gasped at the sudden cold wetness. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Richard said, his tone flat and unconvincing. He tossed a cocktail napkin onto her tray without stopping. "You might want to blot that." Dorothy's seatmate looked up from his laptop, his expression shifting from surprise to indignation. "That's completely unacceptable," he said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. He handed Dorothy his unused cloth napkin. "Here, please, use this instead." "Thank you," Dorothy said quietly, dabbing at the spreading water stain. She had spent her life being underestimated and overlooked, and while it still stung, she had learned long ago that keeping her dignity mattered more than demanding recognition. 2 rows behind, Lisa Harris watched the scene unfold with narrowing eyes. She was the executive vice president of operations at Skyline Airlines, though no one on the flight knew that yet. She had been taking this route to observe service quality incognito, a regular practice she had instituted years ago at Dorothy's suggestion. What she was witnessing made her blood boil, but she maintained her professional composure, continuing to document everything on her tablet. After a few more minutes, Dorothy decided she needed to address the situation directly. She pressed the call button, its soft ding sounding above the white noise of the aircraft engines. Richard appeared with visible reluctance. "Yes?" he asked curtly, not using ma'am or offering any other polite address. "I'd like to speak with the lead flight attendant, please," Dorothy said calmly. Richard's expression tightened. "I am handling this section. Is there a problem with your service?" The businessman beside Dorothy let out a disbelieving laugh. "Is that a serious question? You've been ignoring her the entire flight." Richard squared his shoulders defensively. "Sir, I've been following our standard service procedures. If there's been a misunderstanding—" "It's not a misunderstanding," came a voice from across the aisle. It was the older white woman who had noticed the situation earlier. "We've all seen how you've treated this lady differently from everyone else." Richard's professional mask slipped for a moment, revealing a flash of anger before he composed himself. "I'll get my supervisor," he said stiffly, turning away without another word. A murmur rippled through the first-class cabin. Other passengers were exchanging glances and whispered comments. The atmosphere had grown uncomfortable, the usual peaceful luxury of first-class travel now tinged with tension. Dorothy closed her eyes briefly. This wasn't how she had wanted to spend this flight. At 72, she had been in business long enough to know when to pick her battles, but this one had found her despite her attempts to avoid confrontation. Lisa Harris used this moment to move quietly from her seat, making her way forward until she was standing beside Dorothy's row. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I couldn't help noticing what's been happening. Are you all right?" Dorothy looked up at the younger woman, immediately recognizing her but giving no indication they knew each other. They had worked together for 15 years, with Lisa rising through the ranks to become one of Dorothy's most trusted executives. "I'm fine, thank you," Dorothy replied with a gentle smile. "Just a bit damp." Lisa nodded, understanding passing between them without words. "I think this situation deserves attention," she said, carefully neutral in her phrasing. A few minutes later, a different flight attendant approached. Pamela, the one who had greeted passengers at the door and who had kindly brought Dorothy water earlier when Richard had ignored her. "I understand there's been an issue with service," Pamela said, her expression concerned and professional. "I'm the lead flight attendant on this flight. How can I help?" Before Dorothy could answer, several passengers began speaking at once. "That male attendant has been deliberately ignoring her. He's been rude and dismissive. It's been going on the whole flight." Pamela raised her hand slightly, gesturing for calm. "I appreciate everyone's concern. Could I speak with you directly, ma'am?" she asked Dorothy. Dorothy nodded. "Of course." "Would you prefer to speak privately in the galley area?" Pamela offered. "That won't be necessary," Dorothy replied. "The issue is straightforward. Since boarding, your colleague has consistently overlooked me while providing service to everyone else. When he has acknowledged me, it's been with obvious reluctance and discourtesy." Pamela's expression grew troubled. "I'm very sorry to hear that. This isn't the standard of service we strive for at Skyline Airlines." "No," Dorothy agreed quietly. "It certainly isn't." Something in her tone made Pamela look at her more closely. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, quickly hidden behind professional concern. From the front of the cabin, Richard watched the exchange with growing unease. He had clearly not expected such a unified response from the other passengers. He approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. "Pamela, if there's been a misunderstanding," he began. "Richard," Pamela cut him off with quiet authority. "Please prepare the galley for our descent. I'll handle this." His face flushed with embarrassment and anger, but he retreated without further comment. Lisa Harris, still standing nearby, spoke up. "I believe this situation warrants documentation. As a frequent flyer with Skyline, I'm concerned about what I've witnessed." Pamela nodded. "Of course. I'll be filing a full report when we land. We take these matters very seriously." The businessman beside Dorothy closed his laptop and turned fully toward the conversation. "I'd be willing to provide a statement as well. This kind of treatment has no place in modern air travel, or anywhere else." Several other passengers nodded in agreement. Dorothy was touched by the support, but uncomfortable with the attention. "I appreciate everyone's concern," she said, "but perhaps we could all enjoy the rest of the flight. I'm fine, really." Pamela wasn't so easily diverted. "Ma'am, if you could provide me with your contact information, I'd like to ensure this is properly addressed by our customer relations team." Dorothy hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." Lisa caught Pamela's eye. "I'd like to speak with you well, if I may, regarding company policy on these matters." Something in Lisa's tone made Pamela look at her more carefully. "Certainly," she replied, her professional smile not quite hiding her growing suspicion that this situation was more complicated than it first appeared. As Pamela moved away to continue her duties, the cabin gradually returned to its previous calm. Dorothy's seatmate offered her another napkin for her still damp dress. "Thank you," she said. "You've been very kind." "Not at all," he replied. "I'm Vernon, by the way, Vernon Phillips." "Dorothy Thompson," she replied, shaking his offered hand. His eyes widened slightly. "Thompson? Not related to Thompson Enterprises by any chance?" Dorothy smiled. "That's me, though these days I'm more focused on our airline division than the parent company." Vernon stared at her for a moment before understanding dawned on his face. "Wait, you're that Dorothy Thompson? The majority owner of Skyline Airlines?" Dorothy nodded, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "The very same." Vernon looked toward the galley where Richard was working, then back to Dorothy. "Oh my," he said softly. "He has no idea, does he?" "Not yet," Dorothy replied, "though I imagine he'll find out soon enough." The revelation seemed to stun Vernon into silence. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, clearly recalibrating his entire understanding of the situation. From her vantage point 2 rows back, Lisa Harris watched this exchange with satisfaction. She had seen Dorothy handle difficult situations with grace countless times over the years, but it never ceased to impress her. As EVP of Operations, Lisa was responsible for everything from flight schedules to customer experience, and what she had witnessed today would definitely result in changes. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their initial descent into New York. The seatbelt sign dinged on and passengers began preparing for landing, adjusting their seats and stowing away items. Richard appeared at the front of the cabin, his face now set in a rigid mask of professionalism. He moved through the aisle, checking that seats were upright and tray tables stowed, but he was noticeably subdued, the earlier arrogance gone from his demeanor. When he reached Dorothy's row, he barely glanced at her, quickly confirming her seatbelt was fastened before moving on. Vernon gave him a hard look, which Richard pretended not to notice. As the plane descended through clouds, Dorothy gazed out the window at the approaching skyline of New York City. The FAMAL, our landscape of skyscrapers and bridges, came into view, a sight she had seen countless times throughout her career. Somewhere down there was the Skyline Airlines headquarters, where she still kept an office despite her semi-retired status. The plane landed smoothly at JFK, touching down with the gentle bump that always signaled to Dorothy that another journey had been completed safely. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings, the usual rustle of movement filling the cabin. Pamela's voice came over the intercom, thanking everyone for flying with Skyline Airlines and announcing the local time and weather. As the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers stood and began retrieving items from the overhead bins. Dorothy remained seated, allowing others to rush ahead. There was no hurry. She knew what was coming next. Lisa approached, now openly acknowledging Dorothy with the respect of a longtime colleague. "Ms. Thompson, I've arranged for ground staff to meet us at the gate. Would you like me to stay with you?" "Thank you, Lisa. I'd appreciate that," Dorothy replied. Vernon, who was preparing to leave, paused beside their row. "Ms. Thompson, it was an honor to meet you despite the unfortunate circumstances. Your airline has always been my preferred carrier, and now I understand why its corporate culture is usually so exceptional." Dorothy smiled warmly. "Thank you, Vernon. I hope you'll continue to choose us for your future travels. We value loyal customers like you." As the cabin emptied, Richard stood near the exit, mechanically thanking departing passengers. His eyes widened when he saw Lisa approach Dorothy with deference, the two women clearly familiar with each other. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Pamela appeared at Dorothy's side. "Ms. Thompson, I want to personally apologize for your experience today. I've arranged for our JFK customer service manager to meet you at the gate." "Thank you, Pamela," Dorothy replied. "Your service was exemplary. Please don't worry." The three women waited until the cabin was nearly empty before standing. As they approached the exit, Richard finally realized something was very wrong. The color drained from his face as he watched Pamela's respectful behavior toward Dorothy. "Richard," Pamela said quietly, "this is Dorothy Thompson." The name clearly meant nothing to him at first. "Ms. Thompson is the majority owner of Skyline Airlines," Pamela continued, her voice low but clear. Richard's expression froze, his eyes widening in shock and horror as the full implications hit him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Dorothy paused before him, her dignified presence suddenly seeming to fill the narrow airplane aisle. "I believe we need to have a conversation about customer service, young man," she said calmly. "I'll see you in my office tomorrow morning." With that, she continued past him and into the jet bridge, where the JFK station manager was already waiting, alerted by Lisa's earlier messages. Richard remained rooted to the spot, the color draining from his face as he watched the owner of the company he had spent the last 3 hours disrespecting walk away. Dorothy Thompson stepped into the terminal, her shoulders straight despite her 72 years. Behind her, The consequences of Richard's actions were just beginning to unfold, like the first dominoes falling in a chain reaction that would ultimately transform not just one flight attendant's career, but potentially the entire airline's approach to service and respect. The morning after the flight, Richard Winters sat stiffly in the reception area of the Skyline Airlines executive offices. The gleaming headquarters, located in a towering skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, felt worlds away from the familiar confines of an aircraft cabin. Here, surrounded by awards, recognition plaques, and enlarged photos of the airline's fleet, Richard felt distinctly out of place in his uniform. His hands fidgeted in his lap as he checked his watch for the 5th time in 10 minutes. 8:30 in the morning. The meeting was scheduled for 9, but his supervisor had instructed him to arrive early. "Don't be late," she had said, her voice grave over the phone last night. "Not for this." The reception desk was staffed by a young man with a friendly smile that did little to ease Richard's anxiety. "Ms. Thompson is very punctual," the receptionist offered, noticing Richard's nervousness. "She'll see you exactly at 9. Richard nodded, swallowing hard. He had barely slept last night, the reality of his situation hitting him in waves of dread. In his 6 years as a flight attendant, he had never been called to headquarters. He had never even seen the executive offices. And now, he was about to meet the owner of the entire airline under the worst possible circumstances. "Can I get you some water?" the receptionist asked. "No, thank you," Richard replied automatically, then winced at the irony. Water, or rather, his refusal to provide it, was partly why he was here. He had spent the night replaying every interaction with Dorothy Thompson on that flight, each memory more damning than the last. The way he had repeatedly ignored her requests, the water he had spilled on her dress, the dismissive tone he had used. Richard closed his eyes, shame washing over him. At precisely 8:45, the elevator doors opened, and Lisa Harris stepped into the reception area. She wore a tailored suit and carried a leather portfolio. Her expression was neutral as she approached. "Mr. Winters," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Lisa Harris, Executive Vice President of Operations." Richard stood quickly, nearly knocking over a nearby chair in his haste. "Yes, ma'am, good morning." "Follow me, please. We'll be meeting in the conference room rather than Ms. Thompson's office." Richard's stomach tightened further. A conference room suggested others would be present. This was worse than he had imagined. Lisa led him down a hallway lined with photographs showcasing the history of Skyline Airlines. Richard noticed that Dorothy Thompson appeared in many of them, from a young woman standing proudly beside the airline's first aircraft, a small commuter plane, to more recent images of her cutting ribbons at terminal openings and accepting industry awards. "How long has Ms. Thompson owned the airline?" Richard asked, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. "She founded it," Lisa replied without breaking stride. 47 years ago with 1 leased aircraft and 6 employees. She didn't just own it, she built it from nothing. They reached a large conference room with glass walls overlooking the New York skyline. Inside, several people were already seated around a polished table. Richard recognized Pamela, the lead flight attendant from yesterday's flight. Beside her sat a stern-looking man Richard didn't know, and next to him, a woman in her 50s who Richard recognized as Diane Powell, the vice president of in-flight services, his department head. "Please take a seat," Lisa said, gesturing to an empty chair. Richard sat down, acutely aware of every eye on him. The room was silent except for the gentle hum of the building's ventilation system. No one spoke. They seemed to be waiting. At precisely 9 o'clock, the door opened again, and Dorothy Thompson entered. Everyone stood immediately. Everyone, except Richard, who took a second too long to react, then scrambled to his feet. Dorothy was dressed simply but elegantly in a charcoal gray suit with a blue blouse. She carried a thin tablet and moved with the confident grace of someone completely at ease in her surroundings. Despite her age, there was nothing frail about her presence. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm as she nodded to each person. "Thank you all for being here." She took a seat at the head of the table, and everyone else sat down. Richard found himself directly across from her, unable to avoid her gaze. For those who don't know each other, let's have brief introductions, Dorothy said. I'm Dorothy Thompson, founder and majority shareholder of Skyline Airlines. Lisa went. Next. Lisa Harris, Executive Vice President of Operations. Diane Powell, Vice President of In-Flight Services. Harold Jenkins, Chief of Staff and General Counsel, said the stern-looking man. Pamela Chen, lead flight attendant on yesterday's Atlanta to New York route. Finally, all eyes turned to Richard. His mouth felt dry. Richard Winters, flight attendant based out of Atlanta. Dorothy nodded. Thank you. Before we address yesterday's incident, I'd like to provide some context. She looked directly at Richard. Mr. Winters, how much do you know about the founding of this airline? Richard shifted uncomfortably. Not much, ma'am. I know it was founded in the late 70s, and that you built it into one of the major carriers. I founded Skyline in 1978, Dorothy confirmed. At that time, I had been repeatedly passed over for management positions at 2 other airlines, despite having all the qualifications and more experience than the men who got those jobs. She paused, letting that sink in. Do you know why I was passed over, Mr. Winters? Richard swallowed hard. He could guess, but he didn't want to say it. Dorothy continued, her voice even. I was told that passengers wouldn't feel comfortable with a black woman in a position of authority, that they wouldn't trust their safety to someone like me. She leaned forward slightly. So instead of fighting a system that didn't want to change, I decided to build my own. Skyline Airlines was founded on one core principle: respect for every person, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Richard felt himself shrinking in his chair. Which brings us to yesterday, Dorothy said, her gaze unwavering. Pamela, would you please summarize your observations? Pamela opened a folder in front of her. On Flight 427 from Atlanta to New York, I observed Flight Attendant Aunt Winters consistently overlooking passenger Thompson's requests while promptly serving other passengers. When Ms. Thompson requested water, she was told to wait. When meal service began, her tray was delivered last and was noticeably cooler than others. When water was spilled on her dress due to turbulence and Mr. Winters' movement through the cabin, minimal assistance was offered. Harold Jenkins, the lawyer, spoke next. We've collected statements from 7 other passengers who corroborated this account. They all noted the disparity in service, and several specifically mentioned their belief that Ms. Thompson was being deliberately ignored or treated poorly. Diane Powell looked directly at Richard, her expression severe. This behavior represents a serious violation of our service standards and potentially our anti-discrimination policies. Richard felt sweat beading on his forehead. I understand how this looks, but I didn't. He stopped, realizing there was no defense he could offer. I have no excuse, he finally admitted, his voice barely audible. Dorothy watched him carefully. Mr. Winters, do you know why I was on that flight yesterday? He shook his head. I make a point of flying on my own airline regularly, usually without announcing who I am. It helps me understand the real passenger experience, not the carefully curated one that executives might see on scheduled visits. She glanced at Lisa. Ms. Harris does the same. Yesterday, we both witnessed service that directly contradicts everything this airline stands for. Richard felt sick. Not only had he treated an elderly passenger poorly, but that passenger had turned out to be the owner of the company. And another executive had been watching too. His career was over, and he knew it. I imagine you're expecting to be fired, Dorothy said, seeming to read his thoughts. Richard nodded miserably. Yes, ma'am. To his surprise, Dorothy didn't immediately confirm his termination. Instead, she asked, Tell me, Mr. Winters, why did you become a flight attendant? The question caught him off guard. I wanted to travel, to see the world, and I liked the idea of helping people, making their journeys comfortable and safe. Helping people, Dorothy repeated. All people? Richard flushed with shame. Yes, ma'am, all people. Yet yesterday you chose not to help me. Why? The directness of the question left no room for evasion. Richard took a deep breath. I don't have a good answer for that. When I saw you bored, I made assumptions. I thought you might be demanding or difficult. I've had experiences with some older passengers who needed a lot of attention, and I prejudged you. It was wrong." Dorothy nodded slowly. "At least you're honest about it. Tell me, did I do anything to confirm your assumption? Was I demanding or difficult?" "No, ma'am," Richard admitted. "You were polite every time, even when I wasn't." The room fell silent. Richard could feel the weight of judgment from everyone present. He had violated a core principle of both his profession and this particular company. There was nothing left to say. Dorothy turned to Harold, the lawyer. What would be the standard procedure in this situation? Harold straightened his glasses. Given the severity and the number of witnesses, immediate termination would be justified under our policies. Richard closed his eyes briefly, accepting the inevitable. "And what happens after termination?" Dorothy asked. Harold looked confused. "I'm not sure I understand the question." "What happens to Mr. Winters? Where does he go? What does he learn from this?" The question hung in the air. No one seemed to have an answer. Dorothy turned back to Richard. "Do you know why I built this airline, Mr. Winters? To prove them wrong?" he ventured. "The people who passed you over?" "Partly," Dorothy acknowledged. "But more importantly, to create something better. When I was denied opportunities, I could have become bitter. Instead, I chose to create a company where everyone would be treated with dignity." She leaned forward. "The easy thing for me to do today would be to fire you, to make an example of you, but that wouldn't address the deeper issue." Richard looked up, confusion mixing with the shame on his face. "The problem isn't just your behavior yesterday," Dorothy continued. "It's the attitudes and assumptions that led to that behavior. And firing you doesn't change those attitudes, it just sends them somewhere else." Lisa shifted in her seat. "Ms. Thompson, are you suggesting we don't terminate Mr. Winters' employment?" "I'm suggesting we have an opportunity here," Dorothy replied. "Mr. Winters made a serious mistake. The question is whether he can learn from it and help others learn too." Harold frowned. "With respect, Ms. Thompson, keeping him on after such a public incident sends a concerning message about our tolerance for discriminatory behavior." "Does it?" Dorothy countered. "Or could it send a message about our commitment to growth and transformation? About our belief that people can change?" The room fell silent again as everyone considered her words. Richard hardly dared to breathe. Dorothy turned back to him. "Mr. Winters, if you were given another chance, what would you do differently? Not just on a flight with me, but with every passenger." Richard took a moment to gather his thoughts. "I would check my assumptions at the door," he said slowly. "I would remember that every passenger deserves the same level of respect and attention, regardless of who they are or what they look like. I would focus on service, not judgment." Dorothy nodded. "Those are good words, but words are easy. How would you demonstrate that commitment?" Richard hesitated. Then an idea formed. I could help train other flight attendants. Share what I've learned from this mistake. Use my experience to help others avoid making the same error." A flicker of approval crossed Dorothy's face. "That's a start." She turned to Diane Powell. "What are your thoughts, Diane? You run in-flight services. Is there a place for this kind of learning experience in your training program?" Diane considered the question carefully. "We do have ongoing training on customer service and inclusion. A real-world case study could be valuable, if Mr. Winters is truly committed to the process." "And are you?" Dorothy asked Richard directly. "Are you willing to turn this mistake into a teaching moment, not just for yourself, but for others?" Richard nodded emphatically. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely." Dorothy looked around the table. "Here's what I propose. Mr. Winters will be suspended without pay for 1 month. During that time, he will work with our training department to develop a module on unconscious bias and its impact on customer service. When he returns to active duty, he will be on probation for 6 months, during which any similar incident will result in immediate termination. Additionally, he will participate in delivering the training module he helped create." Harold still looked skeptical. It's an unorthodox approach. This company was built on unorthodox approaches, Dorothy reminded him with a small smile. Sometimes, the unexpected path leads to the best outcomes. Lisa nodded slowly. I support this plan. It turns a negative into a potential positive for the entire organization. Diane also agreed, though with a warning to Richard. This is a rare second chance, Mr. Winters. Make the most of it. Pamela, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, spoke up. If I may, I'd like to be involved in the training development as well. I've seen how these situations affect not just the passenger being discriminated against, but everyone who witnesses it. That perspective should be included. Excellent suggestion, Dorothy approved. Richard looked around the table in disbelief. He had walked into this room expecting to lose his job. Instead, he was being offered a path to redemption, a difficult one, but a path nonetheless. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't deserve this chance, but I promise, I won't waste it. Dorothy fixed him with a steady gaze. No, Mr. Winters, you don't deserve it. But sometimes in life we receive grace we haven't earned. The question is what we do with it. She stood, signaling the end of the meeting. I expect to see the training module proposal in 2 weeks. Ms. Powell, please make the necessary arrangements for Mr. Winters' suspension and probation period. As everyone gathered their things, Dorothy paused beside Richard's chair. The true measure of a person isn't in never making mistakes, she said quietly. It's in how they respond when those mistakes are revealed. With that, she left the room, leaving Richard with a mixture of shame, relief, and something else. A determination to prove her right for giving him this unexpected second chance, as Lisa Harris followed Dorothy out. She couldn't help but admire the older woman's approach. In a world that often demanded punishment and public shaming, Dorothy had chosen a path that offered the possibility of real change, not just for one flight attendant, but potentially for an entire organization. Do you think he'll follow through? Lisa asked as they walked toward Dorothy's office. Dorothy smiled thoughtfully. I'm not sure, but I know this. 47 years ago, someone took a chance on me when they didn't have to. Sometimes that's all people need to become better than they were. Behind them, Richard sat alone in the conference room, the weight of what had just happened slowly sinking in. His journey from ignorance to understanding was just beginning, but for the first time he felt grateful for the wake-up call he had received, even if it had come in the most uncomfortable way imaginable. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie in the mirror of the men's room at Airline's headquarters. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful meeting with Dorothy Thompson and the executive team. Today, he would present the training module he had developed during his suspension, a program designed to address unconscious bias in customer service. The past 3 weeks had been the most humbling and transformative of his life. Instead of flying the friendly skies, Richard had spent his days in a small office at the training center, working alongside Pamela Chen and a team from Human Resources to create something meaningful from his mistake. You can do this, he told. His reflection, though the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed his nervousness. A knock on the door broke his concentration. 5 minutes, Richard, called Pamela's voice from the hallway. The room is filling up. I'll be right there, he replied, taking one deep breath before exiting the restroom. The training center's main classroom was indeed filling up when Richard arrived. About 30 flight attendants, some he recognized, others he didn't, were taking seats, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. At the back of the room, he spotted Lisa Harris and Diane Powell, and there, in the center of the front row, sat Dorothy Thompson herself, elegant as ever in a simple navy suit. Pamela gave his arm a reassuring squeeze as they moved to the front of the room. Over the past weeks, she had become an unexpected ally, pushing him to dig deeper into his assumptions and helping him shape his experiences into teachable moments. Good morning, everyone, Pamela began once everyone was seated. Thank you for joining us today for this special training session. As you know, at Skyline Airlines, we pride ourselves on providing exceptional service to all our passengers. Today's session focuses on how unconscious bias can impact that service, sometimes in ways we don't even realize. She paused, glancing at Richard. I'm going to turn the floor over to Richard Winters, who has something important to share with you all. Richard stepped forward, feeling every eye in the room on him. His mouth felt dry. Thank you, Pamela, he began, his voice shakier than he would have liked. I want to start by telling you about a flight I worked 3 weeks ago. A flight that changed my perspective and nearly cost me my career. For the next 10 minutes, Richard recounted the story of that day, how he had systematically ignored and disrespected an elderly black woman in first class, how other passengers had noticed and spoken up, and the moment of horrifying realization when he discovered she was Dorothy Thompson, the owner of the airline. I could stand here and tell you that I didn't know who she was, and that's true, Richard said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. But that's not an excuse. It's actually the point. It shouldn't matter who a passenger is, whether they own the airline or not, whether they're famous or unknown, whether they look like me or different from me. Every person deserves the same level of respect and service. As Richard continued his presentation, he noticed Dorothy watching him intently, her expression thoughtful, but revealing nothing of her assessment. The truth is, I made assumptions that day, Richard admitted. Assumptions based on what Ms. Thompson looked like, how she was dressed, her age. I decided, without even realizing it, that she wasn't as important as the other passengers, and I acted on that assumption in ways that were disrespectful and hurtful. Richard clicked to the next slide, which displayed a definition of unconscious bias. We all have biases, preferences, and assumptions we may not even be aware of. They're shaped by our upbringing, our experiences, the media we consume, the people we know. The problem isn't having these biases. It's failing to recognize them and letting them affect how we treat others. As the presentation continued, Richard shared specific examples from the flight, contrasting his treatment of Dorothy with how he had interacted with other passengers. He didn't shy away from the uncomfortable details, knowing that the impact of his story depended on his honesty. When Ms. Thompson asked for water the first time, I told her I'd be back, but I never came back, he recalled. When she asked again, I made an excuse about the order of service, even though I had already served people seated behind her. During meal service, I served her last, and her food was cold. When water spilled on her dress, partly because of my carelessness, I barely acknowledged it. Richard paused, swallowing hard. What's most disturbing to me now, looking back, is that I didn't even realize what I was doing. I had created a narrative in my mind about who deserved my attention and who didn't, and I was acting on it without conscious thought. From the back of the room, Lisa Harris watched with growing approval. When Dorothy had proposed this unusual punishment instead of termination, Lisa had been skeptical. But seeing Richard now, vulnerable, honest, clearly changed by the experience, she understood Dorothy's wisdom. So what can we do? Richard continued, moving to the practical portion of the presentation. How do we recognize and address our own unconscious biases before they affect our interactions with passengers? He outlined a series of strategies: self-awareness exercises, the pause and reflect technique before responding to passengers, maintaining consistent service standards regardless of personal impressions, and how to respectfully intervene when witnessing bias from colleagues. The most important thing I've learned, Richard said toward the end, is that this isn't about being perfect. It's about being aware and being willing to grow. I made a serious mistake. I'm standing here today not because I did everything right, but because Ms. Thompson believed I could learn from doing something very wrong. He turned toward Dorothy, acknowledging her directly for the first time in the presentation. And for that opportunity, I am profoundly grateful. Dorothy nodded, slightly, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. After Richard finished, Pamela facilitated a discussion. To his surprise, many of his colleagues shared their own experiences. Times they had caught themselves making assumptions about passengers based on appearance, accent, or behavior. I once spent an entire flight giving extra attention to a passenger in a business suit because I assumed he was a frequent flyer, while practically ignoring the college student next to him, admitted a veteran flight attendant. Turned out the student's father owned a major hotel chain, and he wrote to the airline about the disparity in service. It was a wake-up call. Another flight attendant spoke up. I think we sometimes don't realize how visible these little differences in treatment are to everyone around us. Passengers notice when we're warmer to some people than others. As the discussion continued, Dorothy rose from her seat and made her way to the podium. The room fell silent as she took her place at the front. Thank you, Richard, for your honesty today, she began. And thank you all for engaging so thoughtfully with this material. She looked around the room, making eye contact with several attendants before continuing. When I founded this airline nearly 50 years ago, I did so with a vision of creating a company where everyone would be treated with dignity and respect. Not just the people who looked important or powerful, but everyone. Dorothy's voice was strong despite her age, carrying the weight of decades of experience. I didn't always receive that respect myself. As a black woman trying to build a business, in the 1970s I encountered countless Richard Winters, people who decided, based on nothing more than a glance, that I wasn't worth their time or attention. Richard lowered his gaze, feeling the sting of her words. But here's the difference, Dorothy continued. Many of those people never recognized their bias. They never had to confront it. They never had the opportunity to grow beyond it. She gestured toward Richard. Mr. Winters made a mistake, a serious one. But today he's turned that mistake into a learning opportunity, not just for himself but for all of you. She turned toward Richard with an expression that had softened considerably. When we met in that conference room 3 weeks ago, I wasn't sure if this approach would work. I wasn't sure if you would truly understand the impact of your actions, or if you would simply go through the motions to save your job. Richard held his breath, waiting for her assessment. I'm pleased to say that you have exceeded my expectations, Dorothy said, a genuine smile now warming her face. This presentation shows true reflection and growth. You've taken responsibility, not just for what you did, but for helping others avoid similar mistakes. Relief washed over Richard, along with a surge of gratitude. Dorothy addressed the whole room again. This isn't just about one incident or one employee. This is about who we are as a company, about living up to the values we claim to hold. She paused, looking around the room. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we respond to them, whether we defend and deny, or acknowledge and grow. After the formal presentation ended, many of the flight attendants approached Richard, some sharing their own stories, others asking questions about how to handle specific situations. For the first time since the incident, Richard felt something beyond shame, a sense of purpose, of making something constructive out of his mistake. As the crowd thinned, Dorothy approached him. "Walk with me, Mr. Winters," she said, not a request, but not quite a command either. They left the training room and walked slowly down the hallway, passing photographs documenting the airline's history. "Tell me," Dorothy said after a moment of silence, "what has been the most difficult part of this process for you?" Richard considered the question carefully. "Facing myself," he finally answered. "Recognizing that I held biases I didn't want to admit. That despite considering myself a good person, I was capable of treating someone unfairly." Dorothy nodded. "Self-reflection is rarely comfortable, but it's necessary for growth." They stopped before a large photograph, showing Dorothy as a young woman standing beside Skyline's first aircraft, a small twin-engine plane with the company's original logo. "When I started this airline," Dorothy said, gazing at the photo, "people told me I would fail, that passengers wouldn't trust a black-owned airline, especially one founded by a woman, that I was reaching beyond my place." She turned to Richard. "Do you know what kept me going?" He shook his head. "The belief that I could build something better than what existed, that I could create a company where people would be valued for their character and contributions, not judged by superficial characteristics." She smiled slightly. "It wasn't easy. We had our struggles, especially in the early years. But that vision sustained me." Richard looked at the photograph with new appreciation. "You built something remarkable." "I did," Dorothy agreed without false modesty. "And now I want to protect it. Not just the business itself, but the values it represents." She turned to face him directly. "Your suspension ends next week. You'll return to active flight duty on probation as we discussed. How are you feeling about that? Nervous, Richard admitted. But ready? This experience has changed me, Ms. Thompson. I won't forget the lessons I've learned. Dorothy studied his face, searching for sincerity. I believe you mean that now. The challenge will be remembering it when you're tired, when you're stressed, when it would be easier to fall back on old patterns. I understand, Richard said. And I'm committed to doing better, not just for a few weeks or months, but permanently. Good, Dorothy nodded. Because I'll be watching. Not just me personally, but through the culture we're building. Every interaction with a passenger is an opportunity to uphold or betray our values. They resumed walking, heading toward the elevator. Your presentation today was excellent, Dorothy said. I'd like to see it become a regular part of our training program, not just for new hires, but as a refresher for all staff. Richard couldn't hide his surprise. You want to keep using it? Even after my probation ends? With some refinements, yes. Your experience is powerful precisely because it's real. It happened here at our airline. That makes it more relevant than any hypothetical scenario we could create. The elevator arrived, and they stepped inside. You have a chance now, Mr. Winters, to transform a mistake into a legacy, Dorothy said as the doors closed. To help shape the culture of this company long after both of us are gone. Richard felt the weight of that responsibility and the unexpected honor of it. I won't let you down, Ms. Thompson. As the elevator descended, Dorothy's expression softened further. You know, throughout my career, I've found that some of my most valuable employees were the ones who made mistakes and learned from them. They often became the strongest advocates for our values because they understood personally why those values matter. The elevator reached the lobby, and they stepped out into the bustling space. Your next chapter at Skyline begins on Monday, Dorothy said, extending her hand. I look forward to seeing what you make of it. Richard shook her hand, feeling not just relief, but a newfound sense of purpose. Thank you for giving me the chance to find out. As Dorothy walked away toward the executive parking area, Richard remained in the lobby watching her go. 3 weeks ago, she had been just another passenger to him, one he had deemed unworthy of his full attention and respect. Today, she was a mentor who had seen potential in him that he hadn't seen in himself. The journey from that flight to this moment had been painful and humbling. But as Richard headed toward the subway station for his ride home, he realized that Dorothy Thompson had given him far more than a second chance at a job. She had given him an opportunity to become a better version of himself and to help others do the same. Monday would bring new challenges, but for the first time since that fateful flight, Richard felt ready to face them. 6 months had passed since Richard Winters' infamous flight with Dorothy Thompson. The late spring air carried the promise of summer as Richard guided a group of new flight attendants through Skyline Airlines' training facility. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the classroom where 20 eager faces watched him attentively. The most important thing to remember, Richard said, his confidence now natural rather than forced, is that every passenger deserves the same level of respect and service, regardless of how they look, what they're wearing, or who you think they might be. A young trainee raised her hand. But don't first-class passengers get priority service? Richard nodded, appreciating the question. First class receives different amenities. Yes, more legroom, better food options, priority boarding. But the fundamental respect and attention you give should be the same for everyone, whether they're in seat 1A or 32F. Another trainee looked skeptical. That sounds good in theory, but when we're busy and stressed, isn't it natural to focus more on the passengers who seem more important, the ones who might complain or leave big tips? Richard smiled, recognizing his former self in the question. That's exactly the trap I fell into. Let me tell you a story about the most important lesson of my career. For the next 15 minutes, Richard shared his experience with Dorothy Thompson, not holding back on the details of his poor service or the consequences he had faced. The trainees listened with rapt attention, some looking shocked, others thoughtful. I was lucky, Richard concluded. Most companies would have fired me on the spot. Instead, Ms. Thompson saw an opportunity for change. Not just for me, but for the airline as a whole. From the back of the room, Lisa Harris watched the session with satisfaction. What had begun as a disciplinary measure had evolved into one of the most effective components of their training program. Richard's story, now shared with every new hire and in regular refresher courses, had become a cornerstone of Skyline's approach to customer service. After the training session ended, Lisa approached Richard as the trainees filed out. "That was excellent," she said. "You've really refined the presentation over these months." "Thank you," Richard replied. "I find I keep learning new things each time I give it." He gathered his materials, checking his watch. "I should get going. I have a flight to Chicago in 3 hours." "Before you go," Lisa said, "Ms. Thompson asked me to give you this." She handed him an envelope with his name written on it in elegant handwriting. Richard took it, surprised. "What is it?" "I'm not sure. She just asked me to make sure you received it today." Curious, Richard opened the envelope, as Lisa excused herself. Inside was a handwritten note and what appeared to be an invitation. "Mr. Winters, your probationary period ends today. Over these 6 months, I have received numerous reports about your performance, both in the training program and on your flights. I am pleased to say that all have been exemplary. I would like to invite you to a special event next Thursday at 7 p.m. at the Metropolitan Hotel Ballroom. We will be announcing a new initiative that I believe will interest you greatly. Dorothy Thompson." Richard read the note twice, a mixture of relief and pride washing over him. He had worked diligently during his probation, conscious every day that his job remained on the line. To receive this acknowledgement from Dorothy herself meant more than she could know. The following Thursday evening, Richard arrived at the Metropolitan Hotel 15 minutes early, dressed in his best suit. The ballroom was already filling with people, executives in formal attire, flight crew in uniform, and others he didn't recognize. Pamela Chen spotted him near the entrance and waved him over. "There you are. I was hoping you'd be here early." "Do you know what this is about?" Richard asked. Ms. Thompson's note was pretty cryptic. "You'll see," Pamela replied with a knowing smile. "Let's find our seats. We're at table 3 near the front." As they made their way through the crowd, Richard noticed several prominent figures from the airline industry, including CEOs from competing carriers and officials from the Federal Aviation Administration. Whatever this event was, it wasn't just an internal Skyline function. Their table was indeed near the front, with a clear view of the stage where a podium stood illuminated by soft lighting. Richard recognized a few faces at their table, senior flight attendants he had worked with, along with Diane Powell from In-Flight Services. "Good evening, Richard," Diane greeted him warmly, a stark contrast to the stern demeanor she had shown during his disciplinary meeting 6 months ago. "Congratulations on completing your probation." "Thank you," Richard replied, still somewhat surprised by the shift in how his colleagues treated him. Over the months, he had gone from being the flight attendant who had disrespected the owner to becoming an unexpected advocate for change within the company. A soft chime signaled the official start of the event, and conversations hushed as Lisa Harris approached the podium. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," she began. "Thank you all for joining us tonight. We're gathered to celebrate a milestone for Skyline Airlines and to announce an exciting new initiative." Lisa spoke briefly about the airline's history and Dorothy's vision of creating a company built on respect and dignity. Richard listened attentively, though he had heard much of this before. Then Lisa's focus shifted. In recent months, Skyline has been developing a new approach to training and customer service, one that goes beyond the standard industry practices to address the subtle ways bias can affect the passenger experience. Richard sat up straighter, suddenly understanding why he might have been invited. "This initiative began, interestingly enough, with a mistake," Lisa continued. "A serious error in judgment by one of our flight attendants that could have remained just that. A mistake, a termination, an unfortunate incident. Instead, it became the catalyst for a company-wide transformation." She gestured toward Richard's table, though without singling him out. That flight attendant's journey from bias to awareness became the foundation for what we're announcing tonight, the Thompson Initiative for Inclusive Excellence. A slide appeared on the large screen behind Lisa, displaying the initiative's logo and mission statement: to promote awareness, education, and accountability in customer service across the airline industry. The Thompson Initiative will extend beyond Skyline, Lisa explained. We're opening our training program to other airlines, sharing what we've learned about recognizing and addressing unconscious bias in customer interactions. Additionally, we're establishing industry standards for inclusive service and creating certification programs for flight crews. As Lisa detailed the initiative's components, Richard felt a growing sense of wonder. The program he had helped develop, born from his greatest professional mistake, was being elevated to an industry-wide platform. And now, Lisa said, I'd like to invite the visionary behind this initiative, the founder and majority owner of Skyline Airlines, Dorothy Thompson. The audience applauded as Dorothy made her way to the stage, elegant as always in a deep purple evening dress. At 72, she moved with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime breaking barriers. Thank you, Lisa, Dorothy began once the applause subsided. And thank you all for being here tonight. She surveyed the room, her gaze briefly meeting Richard's. 47 years ago, when I founded Skyline Airlines, my goal was simple but ambitious: to create an airline where every person would be treated with dignity and respect, where service would be based on the ticket you purchased, not the color of your skin or your gender or your age, Dorothy continued, her voice strong despite her years. We've come a long way since then, but as an incident on one of our flights 6 months ago reminded us, the work is never truly done. Biases, often unconscious, unintended, can still affect how we treat one another. She explained how that incident had inspired a reevaluation of Skyline's training programs and service standards. We turned a negative experience into an opportunity for growth. And now, we want to share what we've learned with the entire industry. As Dorothy outlined the specifics of the initiative, Richard reflected on his own journey since that fateful flight. The shame he had felt in those early days had gradually transformed into purpose. His presentations to flight crews had evolved and expanded. What had begun as penance had become passion. The Thompson Initiative will include scholarships for underrepresented groups entering aviation, research grants for studying inclusive practices, and an annual industry conference, Dorothy explained. But at its heart are the personal stories and real,